Hey guys, tonight we're not talking about the public version of history, not the version written in letters, or rules, or etiquette manuals. We're stepping into the hours when the house finally went quiet, when doors were closed, lamps were lowered, and women were, for the first time all day, left alone with their thoughts. This is not a story about scandal. It's a story about what happened after restraint. In the 18th and 19th centuries, women spent entire days being watched by family, by employers, by neighbors, by expectation itself. Speech was measured, movement was noticed, desire was named improper long before it was ever felt. But night changed things. When the last footsteps faded, when breathing slowed in nearby rooms, when the house no longer demanded performance, something else surfaced. Not action, not rebellion, something quieter, more dangerous. Thoughts that were never spoken, memories that returned without permission, curiosity that had nowhere to go except inward. Some women prayed longer than necessary. Some reread the same passages until the words blurred. Some lay awake, imagining conversations they would never have, touches they would never admit to wanting, lives that would never be lived. History rarely records these moments, but they happened night after night in ordinary houses to ordinary women. So tonight, as you listen, ask yourself quietly, what parts of a person only exist when no one is watching? And if this kind of slow, honest history helps your mind finally rest, you're welcome to stay with us. Not out of habit, but only if these stories keep you company in the dark. Now, let the house go quiet. When the house finally went quiet, it was not sudden. Silence arrived in layers. First, the sharper sounds disappeared. Boots on wood, chairs pulled back, doors closing with intention. Then came the softer noises, murmured conversations trailing off, the last clink of crockery, the careful movement of someone not wishing to wake another. Only after all of this did the deeper quiet settle, the kind that felt thick rather than empty. For women in the 18th and 19th centuries, this moment marked the end of visibility. Throughout the day, their bodies had existed within a field of observation. Even when alone, they were not unseen. Expectations lingered in rooms long after people left them. Posture, speech, restraint, these were not behaviors that switched off easily. They were habits learned early, reinforced daily, and carried into the night like an extra layer of clothing. The quiet did not immediately bring rest. Instead, it created space. Space for the mind to loosen its grip on performance. Space where thoughts no longer needed to be filtered before forming. This transition was rarely comfortable. Many women described the first minutes of stillness as unsettling, as though something unfinished had been left behind. Without tasks, without roles, the mind began to wander where it had not been allowed to go during daylight. Bedrooms were not sanctuaries. They were functional places, often shared, sometimes improvised. A bed might be separated from another by nothing more than a curtain, or by the understanding that certain things would not be acknowledged. Candles were used sparingly. Lamps were turned low. Darkness was practical, not romantic. And yet, within that darkness, awareness sharpened rather than faded. Women lay awake, listening to the house itself. The settling of wood, the faint movement of air, the distant sound of someone turning in another room. These noises were familiar, repeated every night, and strangely grounding. They confirmed that the world was still intact, even if the mind had begun to drift away from it. It was during these hours that thought became less disciplined. The structure of the day no longer held it in place. Ideas arrived without invitation and stayed longer than expected. A remembered conversation replayed itself with altered endings. A glance received earlier took on new meaning. A sentence read weeks ago returned, stripped of context, heavy with implication. Many women turned to prayer during this time, but not always out of devotion. Prayer offered rhythm. It gave the hands something to do, the mouth something to shape, the mind something to circle around. Repeated words could quiet thoughts without confronting them directly. For some, prayer was less about belief and more about containment. Others reached for books, not to learn, but to linger. Pages were reread. Certain passages received more attention than others. The act of reading slowly, deliberately, became a private ritual. No one else needed to know which sentences were returned to again and again. No one needed to know what they stirred. Diaries, when they existed, were approached carefully at night. Some women wrote only factual details, as if to avoid leaving evidence of feeling. Others allowed themselves small admissions, couched in language that softened their weight. Pages were sometimes torn out later, removed not in shame, but in caution. What felt safe at night did not always feel safe by morning. The body, too, became more noticeable once the house quieted. During the day, physical awareness was often secondary to labor. At night, without distraction, sensation returned. The weight of blankets, the warmth or cold of the room, the simple fact of breath moving in and out. For some women, this awareness was grounding. For others, it was restless. Sleep did not come easily to everyone, not because of noise, but because of accumulation. Thoughts stacked themselves without resolution. The mind revisited moments that had been dismissed earlier as unimportant. A look held too long. A remark that landed differently than intended. Night gave these fragments room to expand. In shared households, silence required cooperation. Women learned to be still, not only for themselves, but for others. Movements were measured. Turning in bed was done slowly. Even coughing was suppressed when possible. This restraint extended into thought, desire, curiosity, dissatisfaction. These were not emotions encouraged to find expression, even internally. Yet they did exist, quietly, persistently, and the night, by removing immediate consequence, allowed them to surface without action. A woman could imagine a different life without planning one. She could feel longing without naming its object. These moments did not lead anywhere, and perhaps that was their safety. Some women lingered at mirrors longer at night, not out of vanity, but recognition. The reflected face looked different when no one else would see it again until morning. Lines softened, expression shifted. In these brief moments, the image belonged solely to the viewer. No interpretation was required. No correction followed. Clothing, once removed, carried meaning as well. Garments worn all day were heavy with expectation. Nightwear was simpler, looser, quieter. The act of changing was not just physical relief, but psychological release. It marked the transition from public self to something less defined. It is worth asking, quietly, what you would have done with these hours, without devices, without interruption, without the possibility of immediate response. Would your thoughts have slowed or multiplied? Would silence have soothed you or unsettled you? Many women did not know the answer until they were alone with it. Letters were sometimes reread at night, especially those already memorized. The familiar handwriting carried presence into absence. Words once chosen carefully, now took on different weight. Tone shifted, meaning deepened. What had been ordinary by day became intimate by night. Memory behaved differently in darkness. Events from years earlier surfaced without warning. Faces long unseen returned with clarity. These memories were not summoned deliberately. They arrived uninvited and left slowly. Night offered no defense against them, only endurance. Some women spoke quietly to themselves during these hours, not out loud, but internally. Rehearsed conversations played out with precision. Responses were refined. Silence allowed this inner dialogue to stretch without being overheard. Nothing was resolved, but something was released. The absence of observation changed the body's posture. Shoulders lowered, breathing deepened. Muscles that had been held tight throughout the day finally loosened. This physical release often preceded emotional awareness. Only once the body relaxed did the mind begin to acknowledge what it had been carrying. These hours were not dramatic. Nothing outwardly happened, and yet they mattered. They accumulated over time, shaping interior lives that history rarely documents. The quiet was not empty, it was inhabited. Consider how rarely historical records describe these moments. Ledgers note labor. Letters describe events. Rules outline behavior. But the hours after the house went quiet remained largely unrecorded. Not because they were insignificant, but because they belonged to no one else. For women whose days were defined by service, these hours offered something close to autonomy, not freedom exactly, but ownership of attention. For a brief window, the mind could move without supervision. Some nights passed without incident. Others felt heavy with thought. There was no way to predict which it would be. Fatigue did not always guarantee sleep. Silence did not always bring peace, yet the routine continued regardless. As the night deepened, awareness shifted again. Thoughts grew less structured. Images blurred. The mind, having exhausted itself, began to drift. Sleep, when it came, was gradual, not abrupt. It arrived quietly, without ceremony. And yet, even as sleep approached, something lingered. A sense that these hours, unobserved and unspoken, were where a person truly existed, not in action, but in awareness. So before we move further into these nights, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, when the world finally stops watching you, where does your mind go first? Let that question sit with you as the house settles again. As nights repeated themselves, women grew familiar with the shape of quiet. It no longer arrived as absence, but as a condition, something that could be entered, endured, and eventually used. Silence became predictable, even dependable. The same sounds faded each night. The same stillness followed. And within that repetition, the mind began to behave differently. During the day, thought was often reactive. One task led to another. Attention moved outward, responding to needs that were immediate and unavoidable. But at night, thought slowed. It circled instead of advancing. Ideas returned without urgency. Questions lingered without demanding answers. This was not idleness. It was a different mode of awareness. Many women noticed that memory became more vivid once the house quieted. Details overlooked earlier resurfaced with clarity. The texture of a voice, the weight of a glance, the pause before a sentence ended. These fragments gained importance not because they led anywhere, but because nothing interrupted them. In letters and journals that survive, women often describe nights as mentally crowded, not with new ideas, but with accumulation. Everything unprocessed during the day waited until darkness to be acknowledged. The mind, finally unobserved, began sorting through these remnants at its own pace. Some women resisted this process. They kept themselves busy even after the house went quiet, mending by low light, folding already folded linens, rearranging small objects. These actions were not productive in any measurable way. Their purpose was containment, keeping the mind from drifting too far inward. Others allowed themselves to remain still, confronting the unease that stillness sometimes brought. Without distraction, thoughts grew louder, not dramatic thoughts, but persistent ones, questions without clear answers, feelings without appropriate language. This was not rebellion, it was exposure. Social rules did not disappear at night. They softened, but they remained. A woman knew which thoughts were acceptable and which were not. Desire, dissatisfaction, envy. These were emotions that could be felt, but not explored openly, even in solitude. The night did not erase these boundaries. It merely made them less enforced. Yet, even within restriction, imagination found subtle paths. Women imagined conversations that would never occur. They imagined outcomes that would never be pursued. This imagining was not a plan. It was rehearsal without intent. Safe because it ended with sleep. In shared sleeping spaces, awareness extended beyond the self. The presence of others was always felt, even when unacknowledged. Breathing patterns were learned, movements interpreted. Silence was not empty. It was negotiated. Each person occupied a portion of the quiet, careful not to disturb the rest. For women who slept alone, quiet could feel heavier. Without another presence, the mind had fewer anchors. Time stretched, minutes felt indistinct. These women often reported listening closely to distant sounds, a cart passing outside, wind against the building, not for information, but reassurance. It is worth noting how rarely pleasure is mentioned in historical accounts of these hours, not because pleasure did not exist, but because it lacked an acceptable framework. Sensation was acknowledged indirectly through references to restlessness, distraction, or fatigue. Language softened what could not be named. The body's rhythms shifted at night. Hunger returned unexpectedly. Warmth became noticeable. Touch, even self-touch, in innocent forms, took on greater significance. Adjusting blankets, pressing hands together. These small actions grounded the body when thought became too abstract. Some women described lying awake, aware of their own heartbeat, counting breaths without intention. This awareness was not meditative in a modern sense. It was simply what happened when nothing else demanded attention. The body asserted itself once the day released its grip. Reading at night often carried a different purpose than reading by day. Certain genres were preferred. Moral stories, sentimental novels, religious texts, all offered emotional engagement without consequence. Characters could feel deeply, so the reader did not have to act. Yet, even within approved texts, women found moments that resonated unexpectedly, a line that lingered, a scene that felt familiar. These moments were rarely discussed afterward. They belonged to the night, not the world. The absence of artificial light shaped these experiences profoundly. Darkness limited vision, but sharpened other senses. Sound traveled farther. Texture mattered more. The mind filled gaps left by the eyes. This heightened internal activity often blurred the line between thought and sensation. Some women reported drifting between wakefulness and sleep for long periods. not fully asleep, but no longer alert. In this state, thoughts became less linear. Images surfaced without context. This in-between space was neither restful nor distressing. It simply existed. In households governed by strict moral codes, these hours carried particular weight. The pressure to conform did not vanish at night, but its audience did. Alone with themselves, women encountered versions of thought they had learned to suppress. This encounter did not always change behavior. It changed awareness. What happened to these thoughts by morning varied. Some faded entirely. Others left a residue, a vague dissatisfaction, a quiet longing, a sense of incompleteness that followed the woman into her day. Rarely could its source be identified. Silence also amplified bodily discomfort. Aches ignored during work became noticeable. Fatigue settled unevenly. Sleep positions were adjusted repeatedly. This physical negotiation mirrored the mental one, a search for balance rather than comfort. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain thoughts returned night after night. Certain memories resurfaced reliably. These repetitions shaped internal narratives that never reached paper. A woman might never articulate them, even to herself, yet they influenced how she moved through the world. It is tempting to imagine these hours as purely introspective, but they were also shaped by external realities. Economic uncertainty, limited choices, dependence on family or employment. These factors hovered at the edges of thought, rarely confronted directly, but always present. Some women used the quiet to rehearse endurance. They reminded themselves of duties. They measured their capacity to continue. This self-assessment was rarely conscious. It unfolded gradually, night after night, reinforcing resilience without naming it. Others experienced resentment during these hours, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. Resentment toward circumstance, toward expectation, toward the narrowness of available futures. This feeling, too, was managed internally, smoothed over by routine come morning. What makes these hours historically significant is not any single action, but their consistency. Night after night, millions of women occupied this same mental territory, unrecorded, unobserved, yet deeply formative. When sleep finally arrived, it did not erase what had occurred, it suspended it. The next night, the process resumed. Thoughts returned where they had left off, as if time had not passed at all. So ask yourself, gently, if you were left alone with your thoughts every night, with no interruption and no expectation of change, which ones would return first? Let that question remain unanswered as the quiet deepens again. As nights accumulated, women developed patterns that belonged only to themselves. These were not routines, taught or approved. They were habits that formed quietly, shaped by repetition rather than intention. The day imposed structure. The night allowed variation. Within that narrow space, personal rituals emerged. Some of these rituals were practical. Hair was brushed longer than necessary, not for appearance, but for sensation. The repetitive motion calmed the body after hours of restraint. Others lingered over washing, letting water run a little warmer, a little longer, savoring the privacy of touch that required no explanation. In many households, mirrors were small and poorly lit, but they still held power at night. A woman might pause before sleep to look at herself without correction, without adjusting posture, without preparing an expression. The face reflected back was not meant for anyone else. This alone altered how it was seen. Letters and journals reveal that many women reserved certain thoughts exclusively for night. Daylight was for fact, night was for possibility. Even when nothing changed, imagining alternatives offered relief. These thoughts were rarely hopeful in a dramatic sense. They were modest, small shifts, slight freedoms. Some women revisited memories deliberately. A past conversation replayed word for word. A brief kindness enlarged in recollection. These memories were not always pleasant, but they were familiar. Familiarity itself became comforting, even when tinged with regret. Others avoided memory altogether. They focused instead on the immediate physical world, the weight of blankets, the pressure of the mattress, the sound of their own breathing. Grounding the body was a way to prevent the mind from wandering into uncomfortable territory. In boarding houses and shared homes, women learned to perform stillness. Even alone, this restraint remained. Hands rested, folded. Movements were economical. Years of being observed had taught the body how to take up minimal space. Night did not immediately undo this training. Clothing removal marked a psychological threshold. Dresses worn all day carried the shape of expectation. Night garments were lighter, less structured. Changing clothes did more than ease the body. It signaled a release from presentation. For a few hours, there was no audience. Some women kept small objects close at night. A ribbon, a pressed flower, a folded note. These items were rarely valuable, but they were private. Touching them required no justification. They carried memory without narrative, meaning without explanation. Religious women often described an increase in temptation at night, though not always in the way sermons warned. Temptation could be doubt, fatigue, impatience, the urge to stop striving. Night stripped away the performative aspect of devotion, leaving only belief or its absence. Reading habits shifted after dark. Passages that might have seemed ordinary by day felt charged at night. Emotional scenes lingered. Certain words carried unexpected weight. Books provided sanctioned access to feeling, allowing intensity without consequence. In some diaries, women described a sense of doubling at night, the self that functioned by day and the self that observed by night. These selves did not conflict openly. They coexisted, rarely acknowledged each other directly. Night self-remembered, day self-acted. Loneliness was sharper after the house went quiet, not always tied to the absence of people, but to the absence of recognition. During the day, effort was seen. At night, effort dissolved. What remained was the individual, unmeasured and unremarked. Married women were not exempt from this experience. Shared beds did not guarantee shared interior lives. Silence could exist even inches apart. Thoughts were still private. Awareness still internal. Night did not equal intimacy. Sometimes it amplified distance. Single women often described a heightened awareness of time. The future felt heavier at night, not because it changed, but because it became unavoidable. Questions about aging, usefulness, and security surfaced without distraction. It is important to understand that these thoughts rarely led to action. Night did not empower change. It allowed acknowledgement. The distinction mattered. A woman could recognize dissatisfaction without challenging it. Awareness alone altered how life was endured. Household manuals of the period emphasized modesty and restraint, but they said little about night. Silence after bedtime was assumed, not explained. This omission created space. What was unregulated was unrecorded. The body's needs reasserted themselves once labor ceased. Hunger returned unexpectedly, thirst, discomfort. Responding to these needs quietly was part of the nightly negotiation. Each movement was weighed against the risk of disturbance. Some women reported a strange sense of safety in darkness. Without being seen, they felt less accountable. Mistakes belonged to no one. Thoughts required no defense. This anonymity, brief as it was, offered relief. Others felt exposed by quiet, without noise to hide behind. Inner tension became audible. Sleep was delayed by unresolved feeling. These women often welcomed exhaustion, not rest, as it forced unconsciousness. The hours stretched differently depending on circumstance. In winter, darkness felt endless. In summer, brief, yet the pattern remained. Silence invited thought. Thought invited awareness. Awareness demanded endurance. Children occasionally stirred during these hours, briefly breaking the spell. Comfort was offered quietly, efficiently. Once calm returned, women resumed their interior lives where they had left off, as if nothing had interrupted them. Morning eventually arrived, unremarkable and insistent. The night self receded. Clothing returned. Roles resumed. What had occurred in darkness left little visible trace, yet it mattered. It accumulated. Over years, these nightly experiences shaped resilience, resignation, patience, and quiet strength, not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent. So consider, as you listen, what parts of yourself only appear when nothing is required of you, and what happens to them by morning. Let that question drift with you as the night deepens further. The quiet of night did not arrive the same way for everyone. It was shaped by class, by space, by the number of bodies inside a house, and by how much control a woman had over her own time. Silence was not evenly distributed. For some, it was brief and fragile. For others, it stretched long and uninterrupted, heavy with thought. In working-class households, the house rarely went fully quiet. Walls were thin, rooms were shared. Someone was always nearby, coughing, shifting, breathing. Privacy was limited not by rule, but by proximity. And yet, even here, a different kind of quiet emerged. Not silence, but predictability. Familiar sounds faded into the background, allowing the mind to turn inward despite them. Women who worked long physical hours often reached night already exhausted. Their bodies ached, hands felt swollen, muscles resisted stillness. Yet exhaustion did not always guarantee sleep. Physical fatigue quieted the body faster than it quieted the mind. Thoughts still found room to surface once labor stopped. In these households, evenings were often short. Lamps were extinguished early to conserve fuel. Darkness arrived quickly and without ceremony. There was little time to prepare for it. One moment was movement, the next stillness. This abrupt transition made the quiet feel sharper, less gradual. Middle-class homes offered more space, but not necessarily more peace. Separate rooms created the illusion of privacy, yet expectation filled every corner. Women in these homes were often more closely monitored by social standards, even when physically alone. Silence brought awareness of this pressure rather than relief from it. In these rooms, the quiet was often broken deliberately. A book left open, a needle kept moving, a clock listened too closely. These were ways of resisting the intensity of unoccupied thought. Doing nothing felt improper, even when no one was watching. Upper-class women experienced yet another version of night. Servants moved quietly below. Fires were banked carefully. The house settled slowly. For these women, silence could feel vast, almost hollow. Without practical tasks to occupy the evening, thought had fewer boundaries. Letters from these households sometimes described nights as interminable. Time stretched without markers, without the necessity of rising early for labor. Sleep lost urgency. Women lay awake longer, not because they could not sleep, but because nothing required them to. Across all classes, one pattern remained consistent. Night loosened the grip of obligation. Not completely, but enough to change perception. A thought dismissed during the day returned with new clarity. A feeling postponed reasserted itself. Domestic manuals emphasized proper conduct during daylight, but rarely addressed the hours after bedtime. Silence was assumed to equal rest. This assumption ignored the mental activity that flourished once the house quieted. What could not be observed was not regulated. In boarding houses and rented rooms, quiet was conditional. A woman never fully forgot that she was not alone in the building. Even when rooms were private, walls carried sound. This awareness shaped behavior. Thoughts were freer than actions, but still cautious. Some women reported listening closely for the movements of others before allowing themselves to relax. The sound of steady breathing nearby acted as permission. Once others slept, the night belonged more fully to the self. Economic insecurity sharpened nighttime thought. Worries about rent, employment, and aging surfaced once distractions ended. These concerns were rarely addressed directly during the day. Night offered no solution, only confrontation. Yet not all nighttime thought was anxious. Many women described a quiet satisfaction in having completed the day. The sense of being temporarily finished brought relief. For a few hours, no one required anything from them. This feeling was particularly strong for women whose days were filled with service. Once others slept, the man's paused. The body remained available, but the role dissolved. Identity softened. In rural households, night followed a different rhythm. Darkness was deeper. Sounds traveled farther. The quiet felt more complete, more enclosing. Women here often described a stronger connection to memory during these hours, perhaps because fewer interruptions existed. Isolation intensified awareness. Without nearby neighbors, the house felt like a small island. Thoughts echoed. The night seemed longer, more deliberate. Sleep, when it came, felt heavier. Despite these differences, the interior experience shared common ground. Across class and location, women used the quiet to assess themselves, not formally, not consciously, but repeatedly. Night after night, they measured endurance. They revisited disappointments. They acknowledged desires without pursuing them. This quiet assessment shaped how they faced the next day. Importantly, these thoughts were not framed as rebellion. They were framed as survival, understanding one's limits, accepting one's circumstances, finding ways to continue. Children, when present, altered the texture of night. Mothers remained half aware, even in stillness. Silence was lighter, more fragile. Sleep was negotiated rather than surrendered. Women without children often described a different tension. Quiet, stretched, unbroken, without interruption. Thought could become cyclical. Some welcomed this, others feared it. The presence or absence of choice mattered. Women with fewer options felt the weight of night more acutely. Awareness without agency can feel heavy. Yet even here, night provided one thing day did not: permission to feel without consequence. Morning always arrived. Eventually, the quiet dissolved, thought retreated. What had been examined internally was rarely spoken aloud. Life resumed, but the impact remained. Over years, these nights shaped patience, restraint, and a deep familiarity with one's own mind. Not dramatic traits, but enduring ones. History often overlooks these hours because they produced no visible outcome. Yet they formed the interior lives of millions. They taught women how to live with themselves. So pause again, quietly, and consider how much of who you are has been shaped not by what you did, but by what you thought when no one was listening. Let that question linger as the night continues. When the house went quiet, night after night, certain thoughts did not come and go. They returned. Not loudly, not urgently, but with persistence. These were not dramatic revelations. They were familiar questions, revisited so often that they began to feel like part of the furniture of the mind. Women learned to recognize them by the way they settled in once the lamps were lowered. During the day, these thoughts stayed at the edges. They waited patiently while tasks were completed and roles were performed. But night removed the need for response. Nothing demanded immediate attention, and so the mind returned to what it had postponed. One of the most common recurring thoughts recorded in women's letters was not desire, but comparison. Not envy in a sharp sense, but quiet measuring, how life had turned out, how it might have turned out differently. A woman compared herself not only to others, but to earlier versions of herself, the person she had been before choices narrowed. These comparisons rarely led to conclusions. They existed as loops. A thought would form, dissolve, and return unchanged the next night. Over time, familiarity dulled their sting. What once caused distress became simply something to sit with. Many women described a strange intimacy with their own dissatisfaction. It was not something they wanted resolved. Resolution would require change, and change was often impossible. Instead, dissatisfaction became a known presence, predictable, almost companionable. Night encouraged honesty without consequence. A woman could admit to herself that she was tired of being needed, or tired of being invisible, or tired of being careful. These admissions did not demand action. They existed only as acknowledgement. In diaries from the mid-1800s, women often wrote sentences that trailed off without conclusion, statements left unfinished, thoughts abandoned midline. This was not lack of clarity, it was caution. Some ideas felt safer when left incomplete, even on paper. Desire, when it appeared, was rarely direct. It surfaced as curiosity, as imagination, as restlessness. Women wrote about wanting something without naming it. The object mattered less than the sensation of wanting itself, proof that feelings still existed beneath routine. Night gave permission for these sensations to exist without direction. A woman could feel without deciding. She could imagine without planning. This separation between feeling and action was crucial. It allowed interior life to expand without threatening the structure of daily existence. Loneliness returned frequently during these hours, even for women surrounded by family. Loneliness was not always about absence. It was about being unknown. Night stripped away performance, revealing how little of the self was actually shared. Some women lay awake, replaying conversations, altering their own responses, not to correct mistakes, but to hear themselves speak freely. These imagined conversations often included honesty that daylight would not allow. Others focused on memory rather than imagination. Past moments resurfaced, a brief kindness, a touch remembered more for its meaning than its duration. These memories were revisited, not to relive them, but to confirm that they had once occurred. As the years passed, these nightly thoughts accumulated into an internal narrative. A woman knew her own story intimately, even if no one else ever heard it. This private continuity offered stability in a life defined by repetition. Aging altered the tone of these thoughts. Younger women often imagined alternate futures. Older women revisited paths already taken. Regret appeared not as anguish, but as recognition. The mind reviewed choices without judging them harshly. For many, the body became a focal point at night. Changes unnoticed during the day felt more pronounced in stillness. Fatigue lingered, sensation sharpened, awareness of limitation deepened. This awareness was not necessarily negative. It grounded thought in reality. Some women reported moments of quiet pleasure during these hours, satisfaction in stillness, comfort in familiarity, relief in not being required. These moments were fleeting, but meaningful. They balanced the weight of heavier thoughts. It is important to understand that these experiences were not rare or exceptional. They were ordinary. They occurred night after night in ordinary houses, to women whose lives history often summarizes in a sentence or two. Silence created a kind of intimacy between a woman and her own mind. Over time, she learned its patterns. She knew which thoughts would return, which memories lingered, which feelings faded by morning. This familiarity reduced fear. What was known became manageable. Even discomfort lost its edge once it was expected. Night after night, the mind rehearsed endurance. Some women described a sense of being most themselves during these hours, not because they acted differently, but because nothing was demanded. Identity loosened. The self existed without explanation. Ask yourself, quietly, how much of who you are appears only when no one expects anything from you? How much of your inner life would disappear if silence were removed? The absence of interruption mattered. No voices, no instructions, no judgment. Thought unfolded at its own pace. This autonomy, limited as it was, sustained many women more than rest alone. Over years, these nights shaped temperament, patience, resignation, depth, a quiet strength that did not announce itself. These traits were not learned in public. They were practiced privately. By morning, the night self receded. The remembered thoughts lost urgency. But they did not vanish. They waited. And when the house went quiet again, they returned, unchanged, familiar, patient. So, as you listen now, consider this. What thoughts come back to you when the world finally stops asking things of you? Which ones have been waiting the longest? Let them surface. There is no need to answer. When the house went quiet, desire did not announce itself. It did not knock. It did not demand. It arrived indirectly, disguised as restlessness, as irritation, as a feeling that something was missing but could not be named. Many women of the 19th century did not use the word desire at all. They spoke instead of unease, or a stirring, or a difficulty settling the mind. Desire, when unacknowledged, learned to wear other faces. For some women, it appeared as curiosity, an interest in stories they were not supposed to enjoy. A pause that lingered too long while listening to another person speak. A sudden awareness of tone, of closeness, of breath. None of these moments were acted upon. Most were barely noticed in daylight, but night noticed everything. In stillness, the mind returned to moments that had felt different, not dramatic moments, subtle ones, a hand passing too close, a voice lowering unconsciously, a glance held half a second longer than necessary. These fragments replayed themselves without context, stripped of social meaning, leaving behind only sensation. Women rarely interpreted these thoughts as invitations. Instead, they treated them as disturbances, something to be endured, not explored. Letters and journals from the period reveal how often women apologized to themselves for having thoughts at all, as if thinking were a kind of trespass, as if imagining something different were already a failure of character. And yet, imagination persisted, not in images, but in what-ifs. What if life had required less restraint? What if wanting did not imply wrongdoing? What if the body did not feel like something to manage? These questions were never answered, but they were asked repeatedly. Many women described a physical awareness at night. The body, ignored all day, demanded acknowledgement in rest. This awareness was confusing. Women had been taught to associate bodily sensation with danger, with moral consequence, and yet here it was, arriving uninvited, without intention. So they learned to redirect it. Some women focused on memory instead of feeling. Others tightened their posture, even while lying down, as if discipline itself could quiet sensation. Prayer was common, but not always effective. Thoughts had a way of continuing beneath words. Desire did not always aim outward. Sometimes it folded inward, becoming self-questioning. Why do I feel this way? What does it say about me? These questions were asked without expectation of clarity. What's striking is how rarely women framed these thoughts as hopeful. Desire was not anticipation. It was tension, something unresolved. For married women, desire could feel even more disorienting. Marriage did not guarantee intimacy. Duty often replaced curiosity. Silence replaced conversation. Night highlighted these absences. Some women lay beside sleeping husbands, acutely aware of distance, measured not in space, but in attention. Desire then became a longing, not just for touch, but for recognition, to be noticed without being required. Unmarried women experienced desire differently. For them, it often felt hypothetical, a curiosity about something known only through implication. Desire existed without object, making it harder to understand and easier to dismiss. But dismissing something does not erase it. Night after night, the same sensations returned, familiar enough to be expected, strange enough to remain unresolved. Many women coped by intellectualizing these feelings. They reframed desire as fatigue, as nerves, as imagination run unchecked. Medical texts of the era encouraged this interpretation, offering diagnoses that reassured women their feelings were temporary and meaningless. And yet, those feelings persisted across years. What does it do to a person to experience something repeatedly while being told it does not exist? Some women internalize this contradiction so deeply that they no longer trusted their own perceptions. They learned to doubt sensation, to treat inner experience as unreliable. Others developed a private acceptance. They did not celebrate desire, but they allowed it space, acknowledging it silently, without action, without confession. This silent acknowledgement mattered. It preserved a sense of inner truth. There are diary entries that describe lying awake, aware of wanting something, and choosing not to name it, not out of fear, but out of gentleness. Naming would have demanded explanation. Silence allowed coexistence. These women were not passive. They were strategic. They understood the limits placed upon them and learned how to move within those limits without shattering themselves. Night became a rehearsal space, not for rebellion, but for honesty. Consider this. How often do you allow yourself to feel something without immediately deciding what to do about it? Many modern listeners recognize this tension instinctively, wanting without permission, feeling without resolution. The conflict between inner truth and outer expectation has not disappeared. It has only changed language. Women of the past carried this conflict quietly, without validation, without community, without vocabulary, and yet they endured. Desire softened with time, not because it was fulfilled, but because it was understood. Familiarity dulled urgency. The mind learned which sensations would pass and which would return. Some women described reaching a stage where desire no longer caused distress. It became background noise, proof of life, rather than a problem to solve. Others never reached that peace. Their nights remained restless, thought circling sensation endlessly without relief. There is no single narrative here, only patterns. What remains consistent is how little of this interior life was visible to others. History records actions. It rarely records restraint. Ask yourself, how much of your life exists only in the space between thought and action? How many versions of yourself appear only at night when no one is watching? These questions are uncomfortable because they are familiar. As the house remained quiet, women learned that desire could exist without consequence if it remained private. This understanding was both liberating and limiting. It allowed survival. It denied fulfillment. By morning, discipline returned. Desire receded into memory. Roles resumed. The night self folded away carefully, but it did not disappear. It waited, and when darkness returned, it reappeared, patient, familiar, unresolved. So as you listen now, notice what stirs without instruction. What thoughts surface when you stop managing yourself? What sensations ask only to be noticed, not acted upon? You don't need to answer them. You only need to recognize them. And perhaps leave a comment quietly asking yourself, is wanting always a problem? Or is it simply proof that something inside you is still awake? As time passed, restraint stopped feeling like a rule imposed from outside. It began to feel like something internal, a presence that watched even when no one else could. By this stage of life, many women no longer needed reminders. There was no voice saying don't. The mind itself had learned the boundaries. Thought slowed before crossing certain lines. Imagination edited itself automatically. This was not obedience. It was adaptation. Restraint had become a habit, so practiced that it felt like personality. At night, when the house was quiet, this inner witness remained awake. Even in solitude, even in darkness, there was a sense of being observed, not by God, not by society, but by an internal standard that never slept. Many women described this feeling without naming it, a tension that arrived the moment the body relaxed, a tightening of thought, a sudden impulse to correct oneself even when no action had occurred. You could be alone and still feel supervised. This internal surveillance shaped everything. Which memories were allowed to surface, which thoughts were redirected, which sensations were interpreted as harmless, and which were treated as threats. The most exhausting part was that this restraint never rested. It did not disappear with age. It did not soften with familiarity. It followed women into widowhood, into illness, into old age. Even when external expectations faded, internal ones remained. Some women reached a point where they could no longer remember when this vigilance began. It felt ancient, as if it had always existed. And because it had no clear origin, it also had no clear end. Journals from the period reveal an unsettling pattern. Women criticizing themselves for thoughts they never acted on, apologizing on paper for feelings that harmed no one, correcting their own imagination as if it were misbehavior. This wasn't morality, it was self-policing. Night made this harder. In darkness, when distraction fell away, the mind wandered naturally. It returned to unfinished emotions, unspoken wants, regrets that had never found language. The inner witness reacted immediately. Thoughts were interrupted mid-formation. Emotional responses were muted before fully arriving. Desire was not allowed to become clear enough to understand. Imagine living your entire life with a hand constantly hovering over your inner voice, ready to quiet it. Some women found ways around this, not rebellion detours. They focused intensely on routine memories, replayed the same safe recollections night after night, childhood scenes, neutral moments, tasks repeated mentally, like prayers. Others used physical exhaustion as a shield. They worked until their bodies collapsed into sleep, leaving no energy for thought. But exhaustion is not a solution. It is a delay. Eventually, even the most disciplined mind encounters moments of weakness, illness, grief, loneliness, aging. These states soften control. In those moments, suppressed thoughts surfaced unexpectedly. Women wrote about being surprised by themselves, by emotions they believed long resolved, by longings they thought had disappeared. The reaction was often fear, not of the thought itself, but of what its presence implied. If this is still here, they wondered, what else have I misunderstood about myself? This fear led many women to double down on restraint, to tighten inner rules further, to become even more vigilant. But vigilance, over time, constant self-monitoring creates distance, not just from desire, but from emotion altogether. Feeling becomes risky, safer to stay neutral, safer to remain composed. This is where numbness begins. Not as emptiness, but as careful neutrality. A life lived within narrow emotional margins. Many women reached middle age having mastered this state. They functioned well, they were dependable, they were respected. But at night, neutrality felt thin. Silence exposed what restraint had flattened. There was a sense of something unexpressed, not dramatic, not tragic, simply incomplete. Some women accepted this incompleteness. They reframed it as maturity, as wisdom, as the price of stability. Others felt quietly resentful, not toward anyone specific, just toward life itself. This resentment rarely turned outward. It settled inward, becoming heaviness, fatigue without cause, sadness without story. Doctors called it nerves. Society called it temperament. Women called it nothing at all, because naming it would have required admitting something was missing. Ask yourself, how often do you interrupt your own thoughts before they finish forming? How often do you decide what you're allowed to feel before you actually feel it? This inner witness still exists today. It wears different language, but it performs the same function. Women of the past did not invent silence, they perfected it. And yet, some nights, rare but significant, the witness grew quiet. Fatigue, overwhelmed, discipline. Emotion slipped past habit. Thought completed itself without interruption. In these moments, women experienced something close to honesty. Not action, not change, just recognition. They allowed themselves to acknowledge what had always been present. These moments were brief, fleeting, often forgotten by morning, but they mattered, because they proved that beneath restraint something remained intact, something human. As the house settled deeper into night, restraint resumed its watch. The inner witness reopened its eyes. Boundaries returned, but the knowledge lingered. That feeling had not destroyed them. That thought had not undone them. That desire had not demanded action. It had only asked to exist. So tonight, as you listen, notice the voice inside you that monitors even your quietest thoughts. Is it protecting you, or is it simply afraid? And ask yourself, gently, without pressure, who would you be if no one were watching? Not even you. As restraint hardened into habit, something else quietly took its place. Emotion did not disappear, but it dulled. Nights no longer brought sharp longing or panic. Instead, they carried a muted stillness, a sense of being emotionally padded. Women lay awake without urgency, thoughts passing slowly without landing. This numbness was not chosen. It developed gradually as a response to years of correction and containment. Feeling less became safer than feeling deeply, especially when there was nowhere for those feelings to go. Many women did not recognize this change while it was happening. They simply noticed that nights felt flatter than they once had. Memories returned without sting. Loss felt distant. Even joy appeared softened, less demanding. This emotional quiet was often mistaken for peace. Families praised calmness. Doctors encouraged moderation. Society rewarded composure. Yet beneath this surface stability, something vital had grown faint rather than fulfilled. Letters and journals from the late 19th century reveal this pattern repeatedly. Women described themselves as steady, sensible, and untroubled, while also confessing an inability to feel excitement or grief with clarity. They worried less, but also cared less. Night after night, this state reinforced itself. Silence no longer stirred reflection. It simply passed. Sleep arrived not as release, but as continuation of emotional neutrality. This numbness served a purpose. It allowed survival without collapse. In homes where responsibility never paused, emotional flattening prevented overload. When one could not change circumstance, dulling response became practical. The night offered no solution, so the mind adapted by lowering its volume. Thought still occurred, but without intensity. Feeling existed, but without demand. This balance kept women functioning within rigid lives. Yet numbness had limits. During moments of disruption, illness, childbirth, death, emotional response returned suddenly and without warning. Women often described these moments as overwhelming, precisely because feeling had been held back for so long. Night intensified this effect. Lying still in darkness, emotion resurfaced, fully formed, unfamiliar in its strength. These episodes frightened many, reinforcing the belief that emotional restraint was necessary for safety. As a result, women learned to recover numbness quickly. They returned to routine thought, structured prayer, repetitive mental tasks. Anything predictable could restore control. Silence itself became something to manage rather than inhabit. The quiet of night was no longer empty, it was actively maintained. This effort went unnoticed by others, yet it consumed significant mental energy. Over decades, emotional numbness reshaped identity. Women described themselves not in terms of desire or ambition, but reliability. They were known for steadiness, patience, endurance. These traits were praised publicly and relied upon privately. At night, this identity reinforced itself. Thought aligned with expectation. Feeling stayed within acceptable range. Individual needs faded behind the role performed daily. Importantly, numbness did not erase inner life entirely. It reorganized. Its thoughts became quieter, more practical. Imagination narrowed. Fantasy softened into memory. Desire transformed into vague curiosity rather than urge. This internal adjustment made nights easier to endure, but also less revealing. Silence no longer exposed conflict. It simply confirmed equilibrium. For some women, this state lasted a lifetime. They aged into it naturally, finding comfort in predictability. For others, numbness became a source of quiet sadness. They sensed something missing, but could not name it. Night after night, they lay awake, aware of absence, without understanding its cause. This unarticulated loss became part of their interior landscape. Sleep reflected this condition. Dreams grew less vivid. Waking during the night became less frequent. Rest felt adequate but shallow. The body recovered, but the mind remained unchanged. Morning arrived without renewal. Days resumed seamlessly, indistinguishable from those before. Despite this, numbness was not universally negative. It protected many women from despair. It allowed continuity in lives shaped by obligation. Emotional intensity, if sustained, might have broken them. Numbness softened experience enough to make endurance possible. In this sense, it functioned as quiet resilience rather than failure. Still, one question lingered beneath this adaptation. If feeling less allowed survival, what had been sacrificed in exchange? At night, when nothing demanded attention, this question sometimes surfaced, not sharply, but persistently. Was calmness the same as contentment? Was endurance the same as fulfillment? The mind rarely answered. It simply returned to stillness. As years passed, these questions faded. Habit replaced inquiry. Silence no longer invited examination. The night became a familiar, neutral space, neither threatening nor revealing. Emotional numbness settled fully, becoming the default state rather than a defense. And yet, even in this quiet neutrality, something endured. The ability to notice, the awareness of self. Beneath numbness, beneath restraint, consciousness remained. It observed without reacting. It persisted without demanding change. This quiet awareness was perhaps the deepest survival skill of all. So as the house went quiet again, and another night unfolded, women lay awake, not seeking resolution, but continuity, feeling little, thinking softly, enduring steadily. This was not the absence of life. It was life reduced to what could be carried indefinitely. Let that settle. And notice, does silence feel peaceful to you, or simply familiar? As women moved deeper into middle age, night began to change again, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The quiet no longer felt endless. Instead, it felt narrower, as though time itself had begun to compress. Nights passed more quickly, yet carried more weight. Lying awake, women sensed that there were fewer future nights ahead than past ones behind. This awareness did not arrive as panic. It arrived as a steady, undeniable pressure that settled quietly into thought. The body noticed first. Sleep became lighter, less reliable. Waking occurred without clear reason. The dark hours felt longer, not because they were, but because awareness stayed active. Thoughts returned repeatedly to the same memories, as if the mind were sorting what remained unresolved. Not all memories carried emotion. Some were purely factual places, lived, people known, routines repeated, reviewed without judgment, simply acknowledged. Aging reduced urgency, but increased clarity. Many women no longer fought certain thoughts away. The effort required felt unnecessary. Instead, they allowed reflection to occur slowly, without resistance. Night became a space of inventory rather than conflict. What had been endured was recognized. What had been lost was named internally, even if never spoken aloud. Women who had lived restrained lives often discovered that regret did not arrive loudly. It came quietly, folded into routine thought. Regret was not always about missed romance or ambition. More often, it centered on unexpressed selfhood, words never spoken, preferences never voiced, boundaries never tested. These realizations surfaced gently, without accusation, and then lingered. Importantly, these reflections rarely led to change. At this stage of life, alteration felt impractical. Instead, understanding replaced action. Women did not seek to rewrite their past. They sought to understand it well enough to live peacefully alongside it. Night offered the only uninterrupted space for this understanding to form. Some women described feeling closer to themselves during these hours than ever before. With social roles loosened by age, internal permission expanded slightly. Thought wandered more freely. Feeling was acknowledged without immediate correction. This was not liberation, but softening, a loosening of grip rather than its release. Physical solitude increased for many. Children had grown. Husbands slept heavily or were gone. Houses felt larger at night. Silence stretched without interruption. For some, this quiet felt like relief. For others, it intensified awareness of aloneness. The same silence could comfort or unsettle, depending on what the mind carried into it. Memory became more sensory. Women recalled textures, smells, and sounds more vividly than events. The sound of a kettle, the weight of fabric, the rhythm of footsteps in a hallway, long since left behind. These details emerged uninvited, filling the quiet with fragments of earlier life that felt unexpectedly present. These memories did not always align with emotion. A remembered moment might carry no feeling at all, yet still insist on being recalled. This puzzled many women. Why certain images returned while others vanished remained unclear. Night did not provide answers. It only presented what lingered. Awareness of time's passage also altered perception of routine. Tasks repeated for decades appeared differently in reflection. What once felt endless now appeared finite. The same action, folding linen, tending fire, preparing meals, shifted from obligation to evidence, proof of continuity, proof that something had been carried through. Women nearing old age often thought less about identity and more about impact, not legacy in a grand sense, but presence. Had they mattered to anyone quietly? Had their absence been noticed? These questions surfaced late at night without expectation of response. They were asked because silence allowed them to be asked safely. Sleep during this period became irregular. Some nights passed quickly, others dragged without rest. Women learned not to resist wakefulness. Lying still felt preferable to forcing sleep. The night became familiar, not something to escape. Stillness itself became rest. There was also an emerging gentleness toward the self. Harsh internal judgments softened. Failures were contextualized. Choices were understood within constraint. Night offered perspective that day never had time to provide. In darkness, complexity replaced blame, yet uncertainty remained. Aging clarified many things, but not all. Questions about meaning, satisfaction, and fulfillment remained unresolved. Women accepted this ambiguity more easily than they once had. Not knowing felt less threatening. Silence accommodated uncertainty without demanding closure. As the house settled again, night carried less tension than before. It became a companion rather than a challenge. Thought continued, but without urgency. Feeling existed, but without pressure. This stage of life did not bring answers. It brought steadiness. Pause here for a moment. If you were alone with your thoughts tonight, which memories would return first, and which ones would stay quiet? As old age approached, night became less about reflection and more about presence. Thought slowed naturally, not because there was nothing left to consider, but because the mind no longer rushed toward conclusions. Women lay awake without urgency, allowing silence to exist without needing to fill it. This was not peace in the romantic sense. It was acceptance shaped by repetition. After decades of nights, the dark no longer demanded explanation. Sleep fragmented further, yet this fragmentation felt familiar rather than alarming. Waking in the early hours became expected. Women listened to the house, now quieter than it had ever been. Floors no longer creaked with children's movement. Voices no longer carried through walls. The house felt hollow, but also stable, like a structure that had finished its work and settled into stillness. Memory at this stage lost narrative structure. Events no longer replayed in sequence. Instead, moments surfaced independently, disconnected from chronology. A single afternoon, a particular winter, a face without context. These fragments appeared without invitation and faded without conclusion. The mind no longer attempted to organize them. Night became a place where memory drifted freely, unconcerned with meaning. Many women reported thinking less about what had happened and more about how it had felt to endure. Not individual emotions, but the long emotional climate of a life. Was it heavy? Was it bearable? Was it lonely? These assessments were quiet and non-judgmental. There was no audience, no verdict was required. Physical vulnerability sharpened nighttime awareness. Pain, stiffness, and discomfort made the body impossible to ignore. Stillness was negotiated carefully. Sleep positions were chosen deliberately, yet even discomfort became familiar. The body, like the mind, adjusted to limitation rather than resisting it. Loneliness changed shape in old age. It became less dramatic, more ambient, not an ache, but a condition. Night amplified this presence, but also normalized it. Silence no longer felt accusatory. It simply existed. Women did not always wish for company. Often, they wished only for continuity. Some women found themselves speaking aloud during these hours, not in conversation, but in fragments, names, observations, short comments on memory or sensation. There was no expectation of response. Voice became a way of confirming existence in the quiet. Sound reassured the body that it still occupied space. Others remained completely silent, conserving energy. Thought occurred without words. Awareness existed without narrative. This state felt closer to rest than sleep ever had. Time passed without notice. Night shortened, not because sleep deepened, but because wakefulness softened. Fear of death appeared less often than expected. Instead, there was curiosity, sometimes neutrality. Death felt abstract, distant, yet present. Night allowed women to approach this idea without drama. They considered it, as they considered everything else, as another condition to be met rather than resisted. Importantly, regret did not dominate this stage. By now, regret had either been absorbed or dulled. What remained was recognition. Life had unfolded as it had. Constraint had shaped it. Endurance had sustained it. These facts no longer felt heavy. They simply felt true. Women nearing the end of life often thought about small kindnesses more than major events. A gesture remembered, a routine shared, a moment of quiet understanding. These memories surfaced gently, often accompanied by physical sensations rather than emotion. Warmth, stillness, familiarity. Sleep, when it arrived, was light but sufficient. Dreams were rare and indistinct. Waking felt neutral rather than jarring. Morning, when it came, did not demand preparation. Days were fewer and simpler. Night no longer needed to carry the weight of the future. In this final stage, the quiet after the house went silent felt less like absence and more like completion. Tasks had been done. Roles had been fulfilled. Nothing waited urgently. The night became a resting place rather than a proving ground. As darkness settled again, women lay awake, not searching for answers, but allowing time to pass through them. Thought thinned, feeling softened, awareness remained. This was not emptiness, it was arrival. And so the night ended again, as it always had. Not with resolution, but with continuation. Another quiet passage, another unrecorded hour, another moment lived entirely inside. If you were to sit with the night without distraction, without expectation, what would remain with you when thought finally quieted? Let that question rest here, unanswered, as the dark carries it forward. As the years continued their quiet passage, nights became a gentle observer of everything that had been endured. Desire, once sharp and urgent, had softened into something nearly imperceptible. Even longing, the kind that once pressed upon the body and mind in private moments, had faded into quiet acknowledgement. Women learned to rest with these absences, to notice what was no longer sought, and to understand that peace did not always arrive as fulfillment, but sometimes simply as lack of resistance. The body, too, had grown accustomed to absence. Sleep arrived irregularly, often interrupted by aches or brief stirrings. Yet these moments were no longer alarming. The dark hours became familiar terrain, a space where the mind could drift slowly, uninterrupted. Thoughts moved gently rather than racing, circling around memory and sensation without pressing toward resolution. The quiet night offered stability where the day had demanded performance. Memories returned unpredictably, fragments of past hours, long-ignored feelings, or small moments of intimacy and warmth. Not all were joyful. Some carried echoes of regret or curiosity about what might have been. Yet even these reflections were observed calmly, without judgment. They existed as facts rather than crises. Women learned to witness their own pasts as one might watch the slow drift of smoke through a room present, visible, but not threatening. Silence carried both comfort and clarity. The absence of external noise allowed women to feel fully, even in small ways. The subtle rhythm of breath, the weight of a blanket, the distant sound of a night wine doll became intimate companions. These were sensations that required no interpretation, no effort, simply the quiet acknowledgement of existence. Night, in this sense, became a form of meditation, passive, patient, deeply necessary. Desire, once restless, now appeared as curiosity. It manifested in subtle ways, a fleeting thought, a remembered touch, or a momentary longing for connection. But it no longer demanded action. The absence of urgency itself became a form of relief. Women discovered that wanting less allowed them to observe more. The body, the mind, and the surroundings could be experienced with full attention, unshaken by expectation. Aging heightened this observational life. Eyes saw details they had once overlooked: the gentle sway of a curtain, the subtle creak of a familiar floorboard, the way light refracted through a window at night. Ears detected the distant echo of neighborhood life or the soft rustle of fabric. The body's limitations forced attention toward these smaller details. Night became a theater of intimate observation, where every sound and motion carried quiet meaning. Sleep deepened, but not as in youth. It arrived in measured segments, light and heavy in cycles, shaped by endurance rather than freedom. Waking hours between sleep were often used not for thought, but for reflection and quiet attention. Women replayed domestic routines, revisited memories of shared spaces, or simply observed their surroundings without expectation. The mind had learned patience. The night demanded nothing and yet offered everything in measured doses. Regret, once persistent, diminished further. It was replaced by understanding and acceptance. Actions left undone, words unsaid, or feelings restrained were no longer burdens. The mind catalogued them neutrally, as though arranging objects on a shelf. Each memory, each unfulfilled desire, each moment of restraint became part of the enduring structure of life. There was no accusation, no lamentation, only recognition. Even grief transformed into a companion of sorts. Loss was no longer acute, but persistent as an undercurrent. The absence of loved ones, the fading of relationships, the passage of time, these were acknowledged calmly. Night allowed grief to exist without dominance, like a shadow that accompanies a lamp rather than extinguishes it. Awareness became acceptance, and acceptance became habitual. The inner observer, that lifelong witness to thought and desire, remained present. It had once enforced restraint, shaped feeling, and moderated desire. Now, in these final nights, it became a quiet companion. Observation replaced intervention. Awareness replaced correction. The mind could exist in its own company without judgment. The night was no longer a trial, but a companionable space. Some women found themselves speaking softly to the dark, articulating memories or observations. Others remained silent, allowing thought to drift in patterns only they could perceive. Both approaches carried the same result: presence. Being awake did not require activity. Being alone did not imply absence. The night had become a space of existence rather than performance. Evenings, once filled with longing, distraction, or effort, now carried simplicity. Food, fire, and clothing were no longer about perfection, but about continuity. Tasks were completed out of habit and recognition rather than necessity. Movement through the house became a practice in calm attention, reinforcing a rhythm that had sustained life for decades. Night was a mirror of this rhythm, slower, steadier, more reflective. Curiosity persisted in small, intimate ways. Questions about the self, about life lived, and about others remained, but they no longer demanded answers. What would have happened if, or did I matter, were asked gently, more as mental exploration than emotional pressure. These questions allowed women to remain engaged with life quietly, without the urgency that had once shaped their waking hours. Physical sensations became a form of memory and reflection. A breeze through a window recalled summers past. The warmth of a blanket evoked comfort from childhood or middle age. Even minor aches were acknowledged as reminders of endurance rather than complaints. Night became a place to feel, observe, and catalog, all without effort or judgment. The body and mind were observed as if separate, yet intimately linked. Stories from journals show women noting small pleasures or curiosities during these nights. The way tea smelled steeped slowly, the rhythm of knitting, or the sound of rain against the roof. These simple events carried disproportionate significance. They became anchors in time, proof of presence, proof that the mind and body were still participating in life, however quietly. The slow erosion of urgency allowed thought to roam freely without interruption. Desire had faded, but imagination remained. Memory persisted without obsession. Observation replaced striving. The night, which had once been a stage for emotional negotiation, became a canvas for reflection, sensory engagement, and quiet endurance. Women existed fully within its space, neither escaping nor striving to control it. Loneliness, now unavoidable for many, was transformed by perspective. Absence no longer demanded correction or distraction. Silence, once sharp, became a companionable constant. Women learned to inhabit solitude without fear or longing. Night became a place to observe and reflect, not to fill or escape. This acceptance carried its own comfort. Sleep, when it arrived, was steady. Dreams were minimal, often abstract, without vivid narrative. Waking was neutral, not startling. The passage of hours became less about accomplishment and more about endurance. The night was a rhythm to be moved through calmly, rather than an obstacle to be overcome. Women had become participants in a slow, patient flow. As the final nights approached, awareness of mortality deepened. Death was no longer terrifying, but a quiet presence, much like the night itself. It was expected, known, and integrated into daily thought. Women considered it as one might consider the slow passage of time or the routine of household care, inevitable, observable, yet non-disruptive. Night allowed them to coexist with this knowledge peacefully. Memory, sensation, and observation intertwined, forming the fabric of quiet continuity. Past decisions, restrained desires, and endured challenges were cataloged internally, each folded into life's ongoing rhythm. Reflection was steady, unhurried, and free from judgment. The inner witness now observed without interference, allowing for a gentle acknowledgement of what had been carried through decades. By the final hours of wakefulness, women were often aware that wanting had nearly vanished. No urgent desires remained. Curiosity persisted gently. Memory persisted gently. Observation persisted gently. Night existed as an unbroken companion. Consciousness endured without demand. This was not emptiness, but completion. The long, patient rhythm of life distilled into its quietest form. As dawn approached, light entered slowly, unhurried. Sleep returned as a calm cycle, unbroken by anxiety or urgency. Awareness persisted, memory persisted. Desire had diminished, but acknowledgement remained. The house, the night, the body, and the mind were aligned in quiet equilibrium. Life continued as it had always been, fully present within its limits, yet entirely unresisting. So the night ended, as all nights had, with continuity rather than climax. No answers demanded, no lessons imposed, only observation, reflection, and enduring awareness. Presence had become its own fulfillment. Wanting had faded, but life remained, fully, quietly, unhurriedly,